Our property markets couldn't be more different from this time last year if they tried. Gone are the frenzied buyers gripped by fear of missing out, housing markets where the prices rose by, $1,000 a day, and auctions that routinely finished millions of dollars above their reserve. Last year's scenario of never-ending price rises has been replaced by rapid-fire interest rate rises. And this is going to be more to come. We've now got slowing or falling property prices depending upon what your postcode is. And there's a general sense of trepidation. If you're a buyer, do you sit on your hands or do you wait for prices to fall further, or do you buy now before interest rates rise and inflation rises more and it reduces your borrowing power and your spending capacity? What about if you're a seller? Do you list now and meet the market before prices may fall further? Or do you hold off assuming that in the future there's going to be less properties for sale, meaning you can get a better price? In other words, what's the right thing to do at the moment? Do you buy, do you sell, or do you hold? That's what I'm going to ask leading financial advisor Stuart Wemyss in today's show. So welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment, and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect, and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now, here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's authority in wealth creation through property, who has been voted one of Australia's top 50 most influential thought leaders.
With interest rates rising and house prices dropping in some locations, many are suggesting that now's a bad time to buy property. But recently, leading independent financial advisor Stuart Wemyss, founder of Pro Solution Private Clients, wrote a great blog suggesting that now's actually a great time to get into property. Now, that's a bold statement, so I'm going to ask him to back it up. Hi, Stuart.
Hey, Michael. Great to be back with you again.
Now, by the way, I agree with you, but let's start with some context. What drove the property boom of 2021, 2020, a couple of years ago, and then let's understand where we are in the market now?
Look, I think a few things drove the boom. And I think it's important to really understand, I try and counsel clients not only just to look at performance, but understand performance as well, because I think it informs us then about what our future expectations should be. So I think it's a very relevant thing to look back and think about, what drove the market over the last couple of years.
Now, maybe I should step in for a second and say some people are going to say it's just interest rates, because that's the argument they're using now in reverse to say that the property market's going to crash. It was more than interest rates, wasn't it?
Look, I think interest rates had an impact, of course, but I think that was a small impact, because really the market was mostly driven by owner-occupiers. Right. So interest rates would have a much larger impact on investors than owner-occupiers. And when owner-occupiers decide to upgrade or first-home buyers decide to get into the market, it's not really about interest rates. It's not really about value or returns or anything like that. It's really about lifestyle and affordability. So, what do I want? What area do I want to live in? What accommodation size do I require or desire? And then secondly, is it affordable? Will I be able to afford it today? And then will I be able to afford it longer term in terms of eventually repaying the loan or at least reducing it to a level that I'm comfortable with? When owner-occupiers make that decision or analysis, they have consideration to not only the prevailing interest rate of the day, but also almost every owner-occupier that I speak to understands that interest rates will change over time. And if they plan to go and buy a home, they tend to plan to occupy that home for at least a decade or more. And they realise over that period of time, interest rates are going to change. So
now that's an interesting point, Stuart, because that last boom was driven by owner-occupiers as opposed to investors who speculate more. So I know when we last caught up, we talked about why one of the reasons we don't see a bubble at the moment is because it wasn't a speculative boom, was it? And so therefore these people aren't going to suddenly sell up when interest rates keep rising.
Yeah, really good point, because speculation can drive prices higher. But also, if it's only driven by speculation or mainly driven by speculation, it can change on a dime. Like, it can change very quickly. Sentiment can change, the investment thesis can change, and all of a sudden, everyone that was a buyer turns into a seller. Well, that doesn't happen with owner-occupiers. It's not like they're going to turn around and go, oh, interest rates have risen by a couple of percent. All of a sudden, I love living in this area, and we wanted more accommodation size and a backyard for the kids. But now that rates have risen, I'll have to sell the property. Of course, that's ridiculous, and I don't think anyone would know anyone that would think like that. So the first thing that drove the market, I think, was firstly a bit of mean reversion. If we think about what property did between 2017 and just before the pandemic, it's a pretty rocky road. And in fact, median prices fell over that 3-year period. They were negative. So I think people started to see, okay, well, we're in lockdown. We started to sort of reflect more on our living environment, and then thinking, well, maybe we want to change that. Of course, interest rates might have been the impetus, because people might think, oh, well, it's really cheap now. It's a good time to kind of get in. So I think mean reversion was the most considerable factor.
Now, for some people, they may not fully understand what you mean by that. It's a term that suggests that if there's been a long-term trend and for a long time you've underperformed, you're going to get back to that mean, the average growth, or in reverse, if you've overperformed for a while, if you have a speculative boom, you're going to get back to that. Now, that works well for other commodities, other asset classes. Is it still relevant for property, Stuart?
Yeah, but it can just take a bit of time. I think markets are more efficient. Well, actually, I don't know if you actually think then about the tech sector in the US. That's outperformed for more than 10 years. And
so is that the new norm?
Yeah, well, maybe it is. It's hard. It's really hard to say, except that you can say with a very high level of confidence that over very long periods of time, the returns will revert to the long-term mean. So you bang on. If we're investing in a market where the performance has been really poor for a period of time, a more recent period of time, there's a good chance, or higher probability, as each year elapses, we're getting to a period where we might enter a growth cycle.
Now, I agree with you, but there's people out there who keep saying, no, you're old fuddy-duddies. You don't understand. This time is different. But they've never lived through the cycles. They don't realise that we've heard that story, this time is different, over and over again. And one of the things we know from history is that we don't learn from history.
Yeah, that's right. And if we think about what are the things that changes a cycle, so how do we know when a growth cycle is going to end and we enter into a flat cycle, or when a flat cycle is going to end and we enter into a growth cycle? And that's very difficult, and I think it would be different for every time. I'm not sure you can necessarily either point to one thing that changes it, but I would say that every time the thing that does change it is different, 100%. It's always different. The next share market boom will be driven by something that we just don't expect or anticipate today, and the next share market crash will also be, and the same with property, right? So it was unique, certainly COVID, low interest rates, etc. That's what drove the growth cycle. But, the fact that we have growth cycles and flat cycles is nothing new, and it will continue like that, because the alternative is a very steady and repetitive return each and every year with no volatility. Well, that's just never going to happen. Right. So, of course,
because of human emotion and fear and greed and investor psychology. So I guess what I'm reading between the lines, what you're saying is that, yes, we had a magnificent boom, a once in a generation boom, as I often say. But if you look back over 5 or 10 years, the markets didn't really outperform. They just went back to their averages. That's
right. Now, I think there is a little bit of premium in there over the last couple of years. So what I've like to call sort of FOMO premium. So, there's certainly a cohort of property buyers or upgraders that were sitting there thinking, hang on, we're on zero interest rates. At that time, the RBA was saying we're not going to raise rates until 2024. And even some commentators were saying, well, maybe rates will remain really low for an extended period of time. And so I think a lot of people were thinking, hang on, these low interest rates are really going to push property higher and higher, so I better get into the market today. And I'm prepared to pay an extra couple $100,000 more today than what the property's worth, because, if I don't buy it today, I'll be paying $500,000 more in 6 or 12 months' time. So there certainly was, in my view, a FOMO premium during that time, not across the board. I think in certain sectors and geographical locations, particularly highly sought after blue chip, high-end sort of property, people were overpaying, and I'll put that in inverted commas, throughout 2020 and 2021. So that's certainly evaporated now.
And they took some shortcuts and they made some bad decisions just to get in the market as well. They didn't only buy A-grade homes, but they bought properties that didn't tick all the boxes.
It's a lesson, I think, in making financial or letting your financial decisions be influenced by emotions. Fear or greed aren't two good attributes to drive your financial decisions.
No, but we're human. Okay, so we had once in a generation very strong boom where property values, almost all properties, went up in value. Regional, capital city, secondary locations went up 20% and some even up to 40%. But why do you say now is a good time? That was the basis of your blog a little while ago, that people can get on on prosolutions.com.au, but also you have a regular podcast, Investopoly podcast, where you discuss these topics as well. So what was the thought process behind, no, maybe you should consider buying now?
I bought a property in 2008, mid or late 2008, I think it was. At the time, I think Bear Stearns just crashed, or one of the investment banks in the US.
Lehman Brothers went down.
Yeah, Lehman, I think they might have been a few weeks
That was a
before.
scary time. I remember those days.
Yeah, it was a really scary time. And I mean, it's different to COVID because we know there'll be an end one day and we'll all get back to work and we'll all get back to our normal life. But
really?
Well, I hope so. With the GFC, it was a bit different because, it was, a financial market crash and, people were saying leverage will be different, business will be different, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a scary time. Anyway, I bought a property when the conventional wisdom was not to buy, and I won't even propose to have been confident about it. I was concerned and nervous about it. Putting that aside, it's always a good time to buy a good quality asset if you're going to pay fair market value. So there's no necessarily, I guess, good or bad time to buy. But if you're buying when everyone else wants to buy, you've got a lot of competition. That means that you're either, going to have to overpay, or it's going to be really difficult to find a property to be able to pay fair market value for, particularly for buying a good asset, by the way, because they tend to not sell. I mean, you can be lucky sometimes, but they tend to not sell cheap.
No, but people don't have to give those away. Now, let's be clear, because some people are going to say, oh, you guys are just perpetual property optimists. I think we're realistic, because for some people moving forward in the current market will cause financial problems, could cripple them. So it's not just for everybody. I believe property investment is a process, not just an event. So rather than just talking about going out and buying a property, the right time for a particular person to buy a property, and I know you counsel your clients at Pro Solutions like we do at ours at Metropole, is to actually make it part of a big process and get your ducks in a row. And it starts with putting a strategic plan together so you know where you're heading, you know what you want to achieve, you know what your financial goals are, and then you set up the right ownership structures to protect your assets and legally minimize your tax. And I think it's really important to have a robust finance strategy. And today in particular, where I don't know, we haven't spoken about it before we started speaking, but a lot of our clients are concerned about cash flow at the moment. More than ever, they're worried about what's going to happen to their cash flow as interest rates go up. So if we protect them by having a financial buffer in place to buy them time to see them through rising interest rates, for those people who can set themselves up correctly, it's a good time.
That's right. And we've also I'm sure we've done a podcast about it, that actually timing makes no difference, firstly. So if you buy the right asset and you pay fair market value or very close to it, timing is not going to have any impact, long-term impact on your returns. So it's actually not important. It's just easier to buy in a market where no one else wants to buy. Firstly, there is a very small chance you'll get a good deal or a better deal, but probability is you'll have to pay fair market value for a good quality asset, but you've got fewer people to compete against. So to my mind, that just reduces the risk of needing to overpay. And in terms of the property optimist thing, I think it's interesting, Michael, to really point out that, we talk about property like it's a homogenous asset class, but, I hear stories even from family members of what property is doing in, say, regional locations. I've got some family in Shepparton, for example, and they're telling me this is what we paid for this block of land, and now in this subdivision it's reselling for this amount, and if you build a house on it, it'll sell for $1 million or whatever. I certainly think. I would rather stick pins in my eyes than go and pay $1 million for a new build house in Shepparton in Victoria. There's certainly sectors of the market where I would say, and I'd be very surprised if you disagree with me, Michael, but where I would say that property it seems way too risky. It's not investment grade. I never invest in it. But if we're talking about blue chip location, strong land value, proven performance, all those sorts of things, yes, I am an optimist, which is not to say I will be a perpetual optimist, but certainly am an optimist about that asset class at the moment.
Well, especially if you take a long-term view, a long-term perspective, and you recognise that our rising population and the government's got a business plan to keep increasing our population and the wealth of the nation, and the fact that we want to own homes, the large percentage of Australians are going to keep wanting to do that. All that's going to underpin our property markets in the long term. But let's be frank, buying when conventional wisdom suggests otherwise is challenging. Only recently, one of the big banks, ANZ, came out with some, again, pretty pessimistic forecasts about what's going to happen and suggested the property values are going to drop considerably. And if you read into their thinking behind it, they suggested rising interest rates, Stuart, is going to decrease borrowing capacity. And the answer is that's true, unless APRA gets rid of its buffers, and that's another discussion that it may lower those a bit. But just because I now can't borrow $1 million but can only borrow $800,000 doesn't mean that you're going to sell your property to me for $800,000. It means in my mind that I'm going to have to move from one suburb to the next, or from a house to an apartment or a villa unit, not that you are going to have to drop the value of your property 15, 20%. I think that's where they're making a fundamental error in their forecasting.
Yeah, look, I think if there's a contraction in borrowing capacity, that tends to lead to a contraction in the amount of borrowings that are new borrowings that are flowing into the property market, which I might say hasn't happened yet. We haven't seen that yet. And sometimes borrowing can fall, the volume of borrowing can fall just on expectation. So if people think interest, so you might argue, well, Stuart, we haven't, because it's a lag indicator, we haven't seen it yet. But I would argue that, well, we should have seen some reduction. We haven't. So as long as the mortgage volume continues to stay at these levels, I can't see a lot of price correction as a result of higher interest rates. And we've got to remember the people that have driven the market over the last couple of years tended to be higher income earners. Their own occupiers and their higher income earners. And those higher income earners are actually in a much, much stronger financial position today than what they were at the beginning of COVID. They haven't had a reduction in income. They can continue to work from home. Their savings rate has gone through the roof. Their personal balance sheets are in really good shape in terms of assets versus liabilities. So even if there's a small contraction in borrowing capacity, it's really not going to change their strategy or plans in regards to property. So it's not going to change demand.
And it's not going to create a lot of forced sellers, which would mean that people have to drop the value of their properties. But having said that, it is difficult at the moment to say, I'm going to buy when the banks and all these theoretically smart people are saying the property values are going to drop. But I think we've learned that conventional wisdom is usually wrong and the crowd is usually wrong. And I know we've spoken in the past, I think I heard it first from you, suggesting one of the reasons people don't want to get it wrong is because of ego. They're making their decisions based on the wrong things.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that's when, you can, as you've said before, Michael, if you're the smartest person on your team, you should be worried. So that's why I think, if you build a team around you, and the benefit of, leaning on advisors at this time is that they give you confidence. So if you turn around and go, look, I'm going to buy this asset, what do you think? And, your financial advisor say that's a fantastic asset. It gives you confidence that you're heading in the right direction. So sometimes not outsourcing those financial decisions, but outsourcing the management, firstly the formulation of plan and then management of that plan can give you confidence in a situation where if you had to go it alone, you might not have that level of confidence. But I think I'm an evidence-based investor. And, and often, evidence can be explained with basic maths or basic logic. So it makes absolute logical sense that a better time to buy is when no one else wants to, and where demand from buyers, from purchasers, is as low as possible because it makes sense. You're going to find maybe motivated vendors, that have to sell, or you've got less competition. You can use that to your advantage. Conversely, if there's 100 people that want to buy a property, then you've got very little chance of paying fair market value for it. So, because there's always going to be someone that's prepared to overpay. So it makes good logical sense.
So I see a window of opportunity. I agree with you because later this year, inflation is probably going to peak. I think most people agree with that concept. Later this year, probably early next year, interest rates are going to peak when the Reserve Bank eventually sees that inflation is coming under control. And then when people realize, hey, this is as bad as interest rates are going to get, hey, inflation is coming under control, they're going to get on with their lives because at the moment, those sitting on the sidelines are creating a level of pent-up demand because people's lives are still moving on. They're getting married, they're having babies, they're getting divorced, they're moving jobs, etc. And once that happens, they're going to get back in the market. And that happens pretty quickly. We've seen that in the past, Stuart.
Yeah, that's right. The market doesn't have to change, or the indicators don't have to change, just expectations around those indicators have to change. So as soon as we get to a point where we feel like, the RBA is getting to the peak of their raising cycle, or that inflation is getting under control, these sorts of as soon as the market starts to feel like that, then that's really when the market will change. So we don't need to wait. Now, there'll be a lot of people that will sit back and go, well, let's just see if the RBA increases at the end of the day by 2.5%, for example. Let's see how much pain that creates. And they'll sit on the sidelines and wait for the forced sales or the rising mortgage arrears or some sort of, and then it won't come, and then they'll miss the boat, right? But the point is that it's not about timing, it's about getting the right asset. It just makes it easier to buy in a market where you have a lot less competition.
So what are you saying to your clients at the moment who say, yeah, I hear all that, but I'm just going to delay my purchase?
Trust me. I think that's all I'm saying is trust me. I've done this many times.
Now, by the way, you don't sell property.
No.
You're an accountant, a financial planner. You run a finance strategy firm as well. So you give a general holistic advice. So you don't have that vested interest in somebody who's trying to sell something.
Yeah, completely independent. It's not going to change my life whether my clients buy this year, next year, or in 3 years' time. It could change theirs, but it's not going to change mine. So I've certainly got no vested interest. But I think the only thing you can do, you can't use logic to change an emotional decision, although at least it's very difficult. I think you've got to use emotion to change an emotional decision. So if people are fearful about buying in this market, then really the best way to change that, I think, is a human-to-human relationship. And for me to say, look, I think it's a fantastic time to buy. I'm buying property now. I'm eating my own cooking. And this is why I think it's a great time to buy. So let's just go and buy. And I think that typically gives people enough confidence to say, yeah, look, Stuart's right. He's seen it all before. We'll follow that advice.
Now, I enjoy getting your Investopoly podcast every Wednesday and your blog on Wednesday as well from prosolution.com.au. And you recently wrote a bit about the Reserve Bank. So I'd like to get your thoughts on that because recently the Reserve Bank's come under increasing criticism for how it handled interest rates. And it misled, now they're not my words, but misled Australian consumers and businesses, suggesting that interest rates weren't going to rise until 2024. And that's the commentary that I gave, and those who watch Dr. Andrew Wilson and me every week in our Property Insider chats, we kept saying that interest rates aren't going to rise till 2023, 24, just relaying what the message the Reserve Bank said. But the critics point out how the Reserve Bank misread the extent of inflation in Australia and is now playing catch up. What are your thoughts?
I think they made, three really critical mistakes. Firstly, it's easier in hindsight. If we think back the last couple of years, there wasn't a playbook, there wasn't any sort of evidence to point to that this would be the right way to deal with a pandemic. And really its response, particularly during 2020, I think was bang on. Like they cut rates in March and then again in November and essentially brought the cash rate down to ostensibly zero. And so they did that very quickly. They then released this term funding facility to the banks that lent them 3-year money at a fixed rate equal to the cash rate. So essentially, almost here's some free 3-year fixed money to go and on-lend it to their customers. So that was incredibly valuable too, because people that had lost their jobs or couldn't go to work, at least then it sort of locked them in, as well as the repayment holidays, locked them into, how much interest they'd need to pay over that period of time. So it did a lot of good during that period of time. So its response was good, but it did make three fundamental mistakes. The first one is to provide interest rate guidance, which is not what reserve banks do. That's why we all listened to it, because it was very unique. So, and at the end of the day, they're in control. So if they're going to come out and start providing guidance on what they're going to do, forward guidance in terms of interest rates, and they've never done it before, you stop and listen. But actually the reality is, or what they should have realized is, this time wasn't any different. And as time's proven, it's inherently difficult to predict what interest rates will need to do in the short run. So really what Philip Lowe should have done is kept his mouth shut. And look, a lot of reserve central banks might come out and sort of commentate to the market, but they really purposely speak to confuse the market. They don't want to actually guide the market about what they might do, because they recognize it's inherently unpredictable. He didn't do that. He changed the strategy and provided that forward guidance.
I guess in some ways he was trying to give people a level of confidence at a time when they were very nervous about what was happening, what the future could hold.
Which I think is maybe the Treasurer's job, or, the government's job, but not someone that's independent. That they shouldn't be making the market. Because they are making the market, so they shouldn't be influencing the market. They set the interest rates, don't influence the market that then has to trade on expectations of what they might do with interest rates in the future. So I think that was the first mistake. The second mistake was leaving interest rates too low for too long. I think it was obvious to Line Freddie, and I think I wrote about this in a few blogs, that the economy was incredibly resilient after the second long lockdown in Melbourne, for example. After we already had an initial lengthy lockdown, spending bounced back straight away. It showed that there was a lot of pent-up demand, that the underlying economy was doing quite well. Okay, unemployment spiked during that time, which is not surprising. The opportunity that the RBA missed was, what they could have done is start very gradually raising rates, maybe each month or every couple of months, maybe by 0.1 or even 0.2%, nothing material, but just kind of sending a message to the market that, hey, this was emergency levels. We don't think we need these emergency levels anymore, and we're going to start gradually making our way. And that would have allowed the market to adjust expectations, and then also allowed them to measure the impact of those rising rates, as opposed to going, oh, well, we've left it too late, let's bang on nearly 2% in 3 months.
What was the third mistake they made?
The third mistake was a bit of a technical one, but they implemented what's called yield curve control, which means what they did is they wanted to manipulate the bond market so that the 3-year bond yield equaled the cash rate. To again kind of set to, because 3-year bond yields are benchmark rates for borrowings, large corporate borrowings, these sorts of things. What they wanted to do is manipulate that so it remained very low, equal to the cash rate, 0.1%, during that period of time, which again was a good thing to do. Made sure that not only that residential or individual borrowing interest rates were low, but also corporate interest rates were low. And then they essentially just abandoned that yield curve control without any warning. And it was a complete shock to the market, and the 3-year bond yield jumped from 0.1% to over 1% in a matter of weeks. So it shocked the market, bond values dropped. And as a result, the bond market has had the worst year on record in terms of returns. Now it's recovering now gradually, and it will recover. So it'll be a temporary bit of volatility, but a pretty dumb thing. Again, you could just speak to the market, particularly you're not speaking to individuals, you're speaking to market participants and institutions and so forth. So they're going to understand the rhetoric and the guidance, and they could have done that a bit better.
Now, Stuart, you've also written that the Reserve Bank's ruined any prospect of decent wage inflation. Why do you say that?
Well, before COVID, the RBA was gradually cutting rates. And what it wanted to do is promote economic growth, and in the hope that economic growth translated to wage inflation. That was the course they were following, and they had been following for many years. it's difficult to debate why wage inflation was so low originally anyway. And it wasn't just unique to Australia. It was really a global issue in terms of low wage inflation. It made some inroads. Whether they were going to be successful, who knows, time would have told, but they made some inroads in order to do that. Well, they've kind of completely undone that now with their most recent hiking cycle. Who knows? The economy is probably going to be quite resilient. I expect actually that, it's pretty dumb to hike interest rates by 2% in only a few months. But again, the economy is probably going to take it in its stride, except there's going to be some particularly lower income earners and so forth that are going to be impacted by it negatively. So it will create some pain, of course. I think going back to that higher interest rate, which is much higher than what it was pre-pandemic, I don't think we'll see any meaningful wage inflation. Maybe it'll be manipulated a little bit by the political parties and the unions through bargaining or whatever, but not driven by economic growth.
Well, recently, Federal Treasurer Jim Chalmers announced there's going to be a review of the Reserve Bank. I think both parties suggested they were going to do that once they got, or if they got elected. What are they looking at, and what do you think the result of all this is going to be? Or is it just going to be another one of those government spends that nothing comes of?
One of the criticisms is there's too many business people on the board and they don't understand the economics and the research behind the economics and so forth. And so they think the board composition needs to change. And I don't think that's completely incorrect. I think you need some business people. You need to know, sometimes the data lies to you, right? So actually business isn't going so well, but it's not showing in the numbers yet. So you need that sort of insight. So you need some business people, but also you need to make sure everyone understands the long-term impacts of zero interest rates as well, so that you get a balanced decision. They think that the governor should be an external rather than internal appointment, and part of that is that they think that the culture inside the RBA isn't so great, that they don't allow varying opinions, even academic varying opinions, and so there's not enough rigour and debate internally. And so they think that an external appointment will serve the RBA better. I don't think Governor Lowe's, his appointment ends towards the end of next year, September 23, I think. He's certainly not going to be extended. That's an absolute, I think. So he'll need to be replaced or another person appointed. But look, hopefully we can learn something from it. And I think the number one thing is that the RBA shouldn't be out there providing any forward interest rate guidance ever. And that's probably the number one thing. Apart from interest rates, that's the number one thing I think we can learn.
Well, let's hope we do learn from our mistakes, as you and I have had to in our own little business life. Now, a couple of times during this chat, we've talked a little bit about Pro Solutions and what you do. And I hope that as a regular on the Michael Yardney podcast, people see that you've got a depth of knowledge and a holistic approach. But can we just quickly explain to people what you do, how you help your clients, and how they can find you?
Absolutely. We like to inspire our clients to adopt a holistic approach to building wealth. Because quite often financial decisions are multifaceted. So, for example,
not quite often, always.
For example, buying a property has, lending considerations, taxation, financial planning, cash flow, risk management, et cetera, et cetera. So we feel by presenting a holistic team of accountants, financial planners, insurance advisors, mortgage brokers, we can sit around the table and talk about one particular client. We can provide holistic advice that maximises their opportunities and minimises their risks.
And as we said, because you don't buy or sell property, that advice is really holistic and independent. And then I know that you recommend people get specific property advice as well.
Absolutely.
I guess it's worth investing in your future because you're going to be living there a long time. So if people want to find out more about you, I'll leave a link in the show note. But similarly, I'd suggest subscribe to Stuart's weekly Investopoly podcast. Wherever you listen to this, you'll find him as well. And yeah, we discuss some of the same things, but sometimes it's worth just listening to it in a different way. So I like talking about your blogs and your podcasts here anyway. So I look forward to catching up with you again in a month, Stuart.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks, Michael.
I always enjoy my chats with Stuart Wemyss. You can see he brings a great perspective to our discussions. In a moment, I'm going to share with you my mindset message, but I'd like to first quickly read a review I don't often do this. I used to do it more frequently. And if you leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to this and I read it out, I'd like to say thank you by gifting you one of my books. So Zia Amazon, who left this on Apple Podcasts, actually from the Philippines, I'd still be happy to post you one of my books. Zia, if you contact me, michael@metropole.com.au. And she wrote, or he wrote, I'm sorry, I don't know. Very informative show. I admire how you and Mark, and talking about Mark Creedon here, are able to share different points of view, giving me and your listeners many options to consider. Your show gives me a broader perspective on a variety of issues and possibilities, which is helping us make better financial decisions. Well, thank you so much for leaving those kind words. And yes, I see our shows listened to by people from all over the world, and it's ranking very, very highly in the Apple Podcasts. So thank you to all the new listeners. Now, I'm going to share my mindset message in a moment with you, but just to follow on what I was talking about with Stuart, if like many potential investors or home buyers, you're wondering, is it the right time to buy? Is it the right time to sell? Should I hold? What should I do? Doesn't really matter what's happening in the property market. I hope that the message you got was it's really more important what's happening in your stage of life. And sometimes it's hard to see. I know at the moment people are worried about cash flow. They're worried about, is the market going to fall? We've had a couple of amazing years from property, and it's not going to be the same in the next couple of years moving forward. We're experiencing higher inflation, rising interest rates, more economic uncertainty. But having said that, it depends upon where you are in your life stage. If it's a home, what you're planning to do. If it's an investment, what your long-term plans are. And as Stuart said, for some people, this is a great window of opportunity if you've got a long-term focus, because in due course, interest rates will peak, possibly early next year. In due course, inflation will come under control and start to subside, hopefully this year, early next year. And as I said when I chatted with Stuart, at that time, greed will overtake fear, and buyers are going to come back into the market as they move on with their life. And in the meantime, if you can get yourself set up and buy the right sort of properties before the crowd comes back, you'll be ahead of the pack. If you'd like to understand what your options are and what you should do, why not turn to my team at Metropole, who've invested successfully through 8 property cycles. Well, I have, and we use frameworks I've fine-tuned over close to 5 decades, a time-tested system with a proven track record. And since we don't sell property, we give independent advice about strategic property and wealth advice, property investment, property development, property management, buying your home, wealth advisory, and even business advisory through Mark Creedon's Business Accelerator Mastermind. Go to metropole.com.au, find out a bit more about what we do, and I look forward to being part of your ongoing wealth creation journey.
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
I recently read a speech given by Bill Gates at a high school where he talked about 11 things he didn't learn at high school. Now remember, Bill Gates is one of the richest people in the world. Clearly, after I've watched that documentary, a super intelligent person and seems like a nice guy. Sure, he's eccentric, but apparently he talked about how feel-good, politically correct teachings created a generation of children with no concept of reality, and how this concept set them up for failure in the real world. Now, that's interesting, isn't it? Anyway, here are 10 of his life lessons. Number 1, he said, life isn't fair. Get used to it. And if you've been around long enough, you will know that's true. Life doesn't owe you anything. You've got to make it happen. Okay, rule number 2, the world won't care about your self-esteem. The world will expect you to accomplish something before you feel good about yourself. Remember, these are 10 lessons from Bill Gates, 10 life lessons. Rule number 3 was, you'll not make $60,000 a year right out of high school. You won't become vice president with a car phone until you earn both. Yeah, I guess there's an expectation of entitlement nowadays in many people, isn't there? Bill Gates' rule number 4 is, if you think your teacher's tough, wait till you get a boss. I understand what he's saying. Bill Gates' rule number 5 was, flipping burgers is not beneath your dignity. Your grandparents had a different word for burger flipping. They called it opportunity. I think I know what he's getting at. We all wanting the fancy job straight out of school. Remember, he was speaking to a high school, to people leaving school, and he was telling them, be realistic with your expectations and don't look down on people or on jobs that you think are beneath you. His rule number 6 was, if you mess up, it's not your parents' fault, so don't whine about your mistakes. Learn from them. Well, that's a lesson that comes through in a lot of these mindset messages, isn't it? Rule number 7. Before you were born, your parents weren't as boring as they are now. They got that way from paying your bills, cleaning your clothes, listening to you talk about how cool you thought you were. So before you save a rainforest from the parasites of your parents' generation, try delousing the closet in your own room. Now, I like that one. You can imagine how that went down at the high school when he spoke about that. His rule number 8 was, your school may have done away with winners and losers, but life has not. In some schools, they've abolished failing grades and they'll give you as many times as you want to get the answer right. This doesn't bear the slightest resemblance to anything in real life. And isn't that the truth? Here's rule number 9, Bill Gates' rule number 9. Life is not divided into semesters. You don't get summers off, and very few employers are interested in helping you find yourself. Do that on your own time. And lastly, his rule number 10 was, television isn't real life. In real life, people actually have to leave the coffee shop and go to jobs. Now, let me give you a rule number 10 that I think Bill Gates would have said as well. If he had an opportunity, he would have probably said, be nice to nerds. Chances are you may end up working for one. Well, there you have it. 10 life lessons from Bill Gates and one I threw in for good measure. I hope you got some benefit from my chat today, and if you did, and you know somebody else who'd benefit, please do them a favour and tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. You'd be doing me a favour as well in my quest to make as many people as financially literate as possible. Now, it's actually really easy. If you've got an Apple phone, there's 3 little buttons at the bottom of Apple Podcasts. Just press the 3 little dots, and there's a share button, and there's a similar share button on Spotify or all the other podcast apps as well. And of course, you can tell the world by leaving a review. Now, I'll be back again real soon, but you can catch me in between shows on social media. Just look for Michael Yardney, and I'd love you to be part of my private Facebook group where every day I leave a tip, some charts, something different that I won't leave elsewhere. Go to Facebook and look for the Property Update Facebook group. And as my way of saying thank you, if you're a new subscriber to this show, go to podcastbonus.com.au, and I've got a bundle of ebooks and reports for you. Now, I've mentioned a whole lot of things, but there'll be some links in the show notes for you, so join me on social media or get those bonuses. As I said, I'll be back again real soon. In the meantime, have a great week. Make it a great week.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success, and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?